couple months ago, The Economist put out an article on the political gender gap, that men are becoming more conservative, women are becoming more liberal, and this is obviously causing conflict in dating relationships and society as a whole. But I actually think this is a great thing because it's actually a return to our natures. Men and women were never supposed to live in the same worlds and therefore not have the same worldviews. Many years ago, Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture. I would take this a step further and say that culture is downstream from nature. At least when it's not co-opted by an aggressive ideology, our cultural viewpoints, our moral viewpoints come from evolutionary biology. If you were a man in the Paleolithic era whose primary role in society was to guard the perimeter, it makes sense you would have a more conservative outlook. You would care about doing hard things, merit-based hierarchy, on valuing the traditions of what worked. Whereas if you were a woman in the Paleolithic era whose contribution it was creating and nurturing life within the interior, it makes sense you would have a more egalitarian, inclusive outlook, a more liberal outlook, if you will. Every social unit, from the two-person relationship to the family to the nation, needs both ends of the polarity. The challenge, though, is how do you have harmony in that social unit while allowing both sides to feel valued and contribute in the way that they can do best? So in this episode, we're going to go into all of that, comparing the two-person relationship, the man-woman or masculine-feminine relationship, with what goes on the highest levels of the nation or even the globe, if you will, to some degree. And there's actually three parts to this episode. One, we're going to start with biology. Someone like myself loves to speculate about how people behaved in pre-civilization times. We're actually going to go even more deep and concrete than that because there's a number of studies that point to the differences psychologically between liberals and conservatives. There's a bunch of behavioral studies that we'll briefly reference, but there's one in particular, a neurological study that shows the differences in the brain scans of liberals and conservatives, which I think illuminates a lot about the evolutionary roots of these different ideologies. Our second part, we're going to go into bringing into the gender discussion, why men might be predisposed to a certain kind of outlook and the reasons for that, and the same thing for women. And we're actually going to specifically dig into why young men of this generation are becoming more conservative than their father's generation, which in itself is quite unusual. Because if you look at the last many generations, I guess since the modern era, there's been an obvious cultural shift left, right? Every generation has been a little bit more liberal than their parents' generation until this generation, right? Younger millennials, I should say, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are coming of age right now, are actually trending more conservative than their father's generation, which is unusual. So we're going to look at why that might be. And then finally, my motive with this episode is, how do you find harmony within the polarity, whether it's in an intimate relationship between a man and a woman, a masculine and feminine person, or a family that needs to be united, or a community, or of course the nation state, and drawing this analogy between a family essentially being a micronation, a nation being a macro family, if you will. At least they follow the same sociological principles, which also leads into a quick announcement. One of the inspirations to make this episode was the Economist article. But also, over the last couple months, a number of men in committed relationships, all who happen to be young fathers, reached out to me with various relationship issues. And the specific issue was different in every case. Maybe it was like a physical intimacy issue between him and his wife or girlfriend, or a communication breakdown, or something else, right? The issues that lead one to seek out relationship counseling. But one of the common through lines, even though all the issues that they brought up were different in every case, one of the things I noticed in all of these cases was a lack of unified reality. The man in this case who was reaching out to me and his partner, a woman, were not on the same page. They were not viewing, they were in basically totally different worlds, but not in a way where they could find harmony, in a way that it was causing disharmony. So we're going to the last part of this episode, but also my announcement is that I have been inspired to make a group coaching program for men in committed relationships. So you're either married or you're in it for the long haul. I mean, you have children together, you're raising children together, or planning on having children together. Like, it's not a casual relationship, like you're actually in it with your partner. I decided to make a group coaching program. It'll be a 3-month program following the principles of basically how do you create harmony in a relationship where the two people are biologically and maybe culturally very different. Essentially, How do you unify a household and create a relationship where both partners can feel really fulfilled on the physical level, on the social or communication level? And essentially, can you as a man in a committed relationship be excited to come home to your partner and potentially kids every day? Can you have that kind of unity where you love being in the relationship as opposed to wondering if you should stay in it, whether you should be in it or not? Like, basically, how do you have like an awesome, unified, high polarity relationship? So if you're interested in that, I'll include a application form along with this episode. You could also email me or DM me on Instagram if you're interested in that. It's specifically for men in committed relationships. And I'll speak a little bit more about that at the end. But I am going to be sharing all of the information that I think is important for men in this situation for free on the podcast, starting with this episode on the ideological side. So first with biology. So as I mentioned, there's a number of clinical studies pointing to the differences between liberals and conservatives. But the one that I found most interesting was done in 2011 by Ryota Kanai, I believe at the University of London. If I remember correctly, they were able to predict with, I believe, 90% accuracy what a person's political leaning would be based on a brain scan, which I find is really fascinating, right? Because like you wouldn't think that someone's ideology, again, which is by definition abstract, would show up in a brain scan. But the way they were able to figure this out is that they found that conservatives have a much larger amygdala. So the amygdala is part of the limbic system. It is one of its primary roles is threat detection. So conservatives, they found, have a larger threat detection center on the like their actual amygdala was bigger. So you wonder why. Why is this? And in the conclusion, or a conclusion that was shared in this study, which I would agree with, is that conservatives are more primed to be wary of things that could potentially be a threat on all levels. So you wonder, like, why is that the amygdala bigger? So the amygdala, with threat detection, one of its more primal functions is the disgust reflex. So, if you're very far on the left and you hate conservatives, this is your opportunity to be like, oh yeah, I knew that conservatives are quick to judge things that are new or judge things that are strange, which is, whether liberal, conservative, at least compared to liberals, that can be confirmed anecdotally, right? Like conservatives generally are less open to change, less open to new things, less open to foreign ideas, let's say. And there's a biological root for this, right? Because the disgust reflex, we all have it, right? If you ever get disgusted, if you ever your nose scrunches, like something just makes you feel disgusted, what does that drive you to do behaviorally? It makes you keep your distance. It makes you not touch the thing. If you smell a foul smell, if you see, roadkill and it just looks gross, like whatever the scene is, and you're disgusted, you're not going to touch that thing, right? You're not going to eat that thing. You're going to keep your distance from that thing. You can imagine our primitive ancestors who know nothing of germs. They just see like a dead carcass and they're like, ew, or they see feces and they're like, oh, gross. I'm not going to go anywhere near that thing. And that reflex protects them from the germs that might be there, the pathogens that might be there. That is why we have a disgust reflex. Now, bringing this to the political arena, why would a conservative have a greater disgust? Well, we can't see germs. We can't see pathogens. If you are quickly disgusted or you're quickly turned off by someone who looks different than you, who's wearing different types of clothes, who obviously is from a faraway place based on the way that they're dressed or they look or their, in many cases, the color of their skin or the language they're speaking, if your immediate primal reaction is like, ew, like, oh, like weird, that's a person dressed in a strange way doing weird things, I want to keep my distance. Well, that might seem insensitive, right? That's the liberal criticism of the right. But it's also protecting you from whatever germs they might be carrying, because you can't see smallpox. You can't see the latest strain of a virus that's going around the world, right? But you can see you can intuit if someone's from a faraway land and therefore might have those pathogens. So if you look at the maybe most famous example from history, the indigenous tribes of the Americas who got wrecked by European smallpox, the tribes that were more welcoming, or we might say more biologically or morally liberal, not even talking about politics yet, but just morally liberal. They were like, oh, okay, look at these strange white people with, coming in their boats and they dress differently and they literally opened the tribes that literally opened their arms to them also opened their arms to the pathogens. Those were the tribes that got the most destroyed by smallpox and whatever other foreign germs the Europeans brought. Whereas if you look at some of the more warlike tribes, let's say from the North American plains, who were more distrustful and, less welcoming of the Europeans, just by reflex, they lasted a little bit longer, or at least they were a little bit more protected from smallpox because they didn't want to literally hug the Europeans. And of course, there's other things downstream of that aside from just the smallpox, right? They welcomed the Europeans onto their land. They ended up losing their land. They ended up being, in violent wars where, eventually all the tribes of the Americas, or North America specifically, if they weren't completely wiped out, they were then forced onto a reservation. We all know how that went for them. You could see how the more conservative outlook, the higher distrust of foreigners actually had a real evolutionary purpose, and it didn't actually work out. Whereas if for an alternate example, some of you guys may have heard of this news story, I think it was a number of years ago. Sentinel Island, which is in the Indian Ocean, is an island where the inhabitants that people on the outside refer to as the Sentinelese, but we don't actually know what they call themselves because they've never allowed a foreigner onto their land. There's a news story a number of years ago where a Christian missionary wanted to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese people, so he took a boat over there and they shot him full of arrows before he reached land. The Sentinelese, one would imagine, probably have huge amygdalas. They have extreme high distrust of strangers to the point where they've never allowed a foreigner onto their land, which means they've been able to conserve their culture. They basically, as far as we can tell, have been living the same hunter-gatherer lifestyle on Sentinel Island, what we call Sentinel Island, but I'm sure they have another name for it. They've been able to maintain this lifestyle essentially from the early Stone Age, right? They live in the same way. They use bow and arrows. They're doing exactly the same thing. One would imagine that their culture and their mythology has remained intact. Like their way of life has been exactly the same for thousands of years, while the rest of the world is obviously modernized, many times over. Their brains, they're probably the most conservative people, one would imagine, biologically, and we would imagine morally. Like they will not allow anyone to come to their land and potentially infect them with pathogens. So they haven't been exposed to any of the diseases that are rampant around the rest of the world, but also cultural pathogens. So in the same way that we can't see germs on people, but we can see their cultural markings, there is a connection between these biological pathogens, and I'm calling them cultural pathogens because, of course, when one welcomes a foreign culture into their land, that culture can dilute the original culture, right? And, depending on your political leaning, you might see this as a positive thing, allow cultural mixing. You might see it as a negative thing of like, oh, now my culture is lost because, this foreign culture came in and no one speaks the original language. This is, the battles you see, the cultural, I don't want to say cultural war, but the cultural battles you see in various places, like in French Canada, Quebec wanted to secede because they wanted to preserve French Canadian culture, not to get absorbed by the rest of, English Canadian culture. You see this still in parts of Spain. Catalonia, where Barcelona is, has wanted to secede. They're trying to preserve their language, right? They're trying to ensure that people still speak Catalan and not just speak Castilian Spanish, which has taken over most of the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. There is a reason why, if you care about your culture, maybe you don't want too much cultural mixing because eventually your culture can get diluted or take over. There's plenty of cultures that just haven't been able to stick around, not because they were conquered and the people were killed, but because a foreign culture kind of overrode, or or a colonial power imposed that the people of the land speak English or French or Spanish, and the original culture is lost. So there is a cultural reason, there's a cultural backing essentially. And this is essentially comes down to the point of all of this. The thing that I want everyone to understand is, one, there's an evolutionary reason for being distrustful or welcoming, right? There's a trade-off, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And there's a real reason for it, right? It's very easy for someone on the left to be like, oh, people on the right are closed-minded. Yeah, relatively they are. We could also, in a moment, we're going to speak about the pros and cons of a more liberal outlook. But we can see that the pros and cons, at least in the extremes, can become very obvious, right? There's a reason for these ideologies, and there are results that come from these ideologies, whether done in moderation or in the extreme. These are evolutionary strategies, and actually, as a bit of a tangent that relates to the biological side of this, My wife and I recently watched the Netflix show Chimp Empire. Pretty interesting show. They follow these two tribes of, I think they're called tribes or groups of chimpanzees, and they're at war with each other. There's one that's really big that lives in a very, we can say, more conservative values, or like they have clear gender roles, right? Like the females are just with their babies, the males guard the territory and fight the wars and do the hunting. But then there's this other tribe that they're at war with, a much smaller tribe. And because they're much smaller and they have less resources, they live more egalitarian, right? The women, the females, couldn't just be with their babies. They needed the females to fight also. So it's very interesting in that you had this one tribe that was very abundant that essentially had the luxury of a gendered role split where the females could just be mothers. There was some, a certain person might say was like a kind of oppressive gender roles because the males had more freedom than the females, which, tracks to what we see in modern society as well. But then the other side, the more egalitarian side, the more, we can say liberal chimpanzee society, because they were lacking in resources, by necessities of survival, they had to be more egalitarian. They had to give the females more authority. They needed the women to fight, even the females who had babies on their backs, when they went to war, they needed the females to fight because they didn't have enough men to do that. So I think that's interesting. And we'll tie this into men and women as humans. And actually, one little anecdote I just want to throw in on the biological things. There's actually a number of behavioral studies. I'm going to maybe reference one very briefly. But one anecdote I think is fun. I have a friend who does marketing for different brands, and he specifically runs their communities, right? So like there's a brand for whatever, he runs their Discord server, he keeps the conversation going amongst their customers. And he has this client where it's a company that makes snapback hats for men who have oversized heads. So guys whose heads are so big that the typical one size fits all snapback hat doesn't fit them. Right. And I asked him, like, wouldn't that be like the most difficult community to run? Because like, what would all these guys, in terms of psychographics, what would all these guys have in common other than their heads being big? Like, what are you going to talk about how your head is so big? Like that's not really a conversation. But he said, no, what's funny about this community of men with oversized heads is they all seem to be into the same interests. They all tend to be politically conservative, which I thought was interesting. They're all into martial arts. They all watch UFC. They listen to Joe Rogan. They tend to like Trump. Many of them like to go hunting and fishing. Like there's something, they all tend to be very conservative. So I told him about this amygdala study, how maybe we can just guess that men who have really big heads also have really big amygdalas. They tend to get disgusted by new things. So therefore they tend, the politically conservative worldview tends to resonate with them more, which is just an interesting, just an anecdote on biology. So anyway, the point of all of this is that ideology is downstream from evolutionary strategy. Culture is downstream from nature, as I'm saying, as I'm extending Breitbart's quote. And, we can see this, tying this into culture a little bit. And, I don't want to speak too much, and we're going to switch from politics to relationships in a second. But one thing that's interesting between Karl Marx's view on politics, and this is very, a simplification of his views. Obviously, Karl Marx, very left wing, or he's like the basis of the modern left wing. And Nietzsche was much more conservative, and many modern day conservatives reference Nietzsche. One thing that they both have in common was what leads to the different classes' morality. So obviously, if you know anything about Marx or hear about Marx, his basic worldview of the world was that there's the oppressor and the oppressed, right? And that's just his worldview, right? Nietzsche, and I've done another episode on this, he had this idea of nobility on master versus slave morality. I'm going to speak about it very briefly. But essentially Nietzsche's idea, and I think this fits in largely with Marx's, even though they took it in different directions, obviously, due to their political leanings, was that in any society where you have a master class and an underclass or a slave class, they're going to develop different incentives, right? And those incentives lead to different moralities. So to just use Nietzsche's language, the master class develops a morality that is very similar to the Paleolithic or pre-civilization morality, especially amongst men, where you're interfacing directly with hard nature, the harshness of nature. Like what you do leads to the result of whether you eat, whether you're able to catch food for the tribe, whether you are whether you win a battle against an opposing aggressive tribe, whether you can survive against the harsh weather conditions. Like, it's just you and nature. So the morality that develops from that, and the same again is between a pre-civilization autonomous tribe where they're basically in charge of their own reality, and the master class of a large civilization. Like, the incentives are the same because those peoples are directly interfacing with the harsh realities of nature. Therefore, they develop a morality that would serve them to deal with the harshness of nature, because that's the game they're playing, right, when it comes to survival. So even you think of like the medieval lord class, or the master class of like a medieval society, they raise their children with certain values that we would now call conservative, right? Caring about order and hierarchy and specifically merit-based promotion, right? Like, if you're strong, you get valued. If you're weak, you're not valued. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. No one cares that much about equality or equity even, because you need to deal with harsh nature. You need to fight other tribes, other kingdoms. You need to deal with potential famine. Like, there's no room when a group is autonomous, when they're in charge of their life, there's not really room to care about people's feelings, right? Like, to use the conservative pundit Ben Shapiro's famous phrase, or the phrase that his followers like to quote, facts don't care about your feelings. And that's kind of the worldview of the master class of any society, which relates to modern day conservatism. Whereas if you were of the ruled class, if you're of the slave class, the peasant class, or thinking about, let's say, early Bronze Age, late Neolithic era, your tribe was subjugated by another tribe. Or if you think about the steppes of the Mongols, Genghis Khan comes over and like conquers your tribe, and now you have to pledge allegiance to him. Like, you are ruled, you are subject to the ruling class. You are no longer directly interfacing with nature. You don't have autonomy anymore. So your morality is going to be a little bit different, because you can't just tell the truth sometimes, because telling the truth might get you punished. Showing too much strength might get you punished by the master class, right? So you have to use the Deng Xiaoping, I think Deng Xiaoping quote, hide your strength and bide your time. That is what Nietzsche would call a slave morality ethic, where you don't want to reveal too much. You need to be a little bit deceptive. And whereas the master class, their primary motive is to, one, survive against harsh nature, and two, conserve their power, which is where conservatism comes from, right? They want things to stay the same because things are good for them, because they're the ones in power. The underclass, they have two different motives. They're not interfacing directly with nature. The ruling class is kind of a buffer between them and reality, if you will, or between them and actual natural conditions. So their first motive is to survive well or be treated well by the master class. And the second is, if they're not being treated well by the master class and they can't morph their behavior for the masters to like them, then they have to rebel. They're seeking freedom. Liberality, hence the term liberal. This is where the term liberalism comes from, is that people who are historically, or are tied to the underclass, or what Marx would call the oppressed, they're constantly seeking freedom, whereas the ruling class is seeking to conserve things the way they are. And this is the roots of liberality and conservatism, at least why we use these adjectives with the modern day left and right. So before we bring this into gender, I just want to really drill that these ideologies are not pure abstraction, right? They come from, you could actually game theory it out, just as we said with the Nietzsche perspective, right? For someone who's in the underclass or the ruled class, or for your literal slave, having a master morality, or like what we would call modern day conservative values, is not that useful to you. If you are of the ruling class, being overly liberal can actually be a threat to your power, right? Like, you have to be kind of hard, because if you're too egalitarian, you might welcome in a Bolshevik uprising or something, right? Like, there's a reason for all of this. So I do want to kind of out myself also, even though I'm in no way trying to impose my political beliefs. And I would actually hope that anyone listening to this, I probably should have said this in the intro, but if you're really political, if you're really politically charged, and I would specifically say if you hate the other side of the aisle, right? Like, you're a liberal who hates conservatives, or you're a conservative who hates liberals. I mean, I'm trying to get across the point that there are reasons for both ideologies, right? It's not out of nowhere. And I do want to say also, in line with the Churchill quote, that if you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not conservative when you're old, you have no head. I will say I have become much more conservative in the last couple of years, partly because of like things going on in politics. But actually, my point with all of this isn't even to go specifically into politics. You know, you could obviously rant about that stuff all day, but recognizing the strategy behind it. And I'll say for myself, I mean, one of the things that has driven me to have a more conservative outlook, and this is we're going to tie this into perhaps why young men are becoming more conservative, but I'll say for my own specific life, becoming a father. When you're a father, when you have when you have a bunch of dependents, now I have three, a conservative outlook just makes a lot of more sense, right? Like freedom of like following your feelings and stuff, which is, I mean, I lived a very liberal life in my 20s, you know, in many ways, like small L liberal, not necessarily political. I wasn't political at all in my 20s. I didn't care about this stuff, but like I lived very liberally in that, like I tried all sorts of things that would probably disgust a very we really discussed a traditional person, whether it was sexual exploration or trying different weird spiritual things, or, you know, in the last 8 years, I've lived in multiple different continents, something that a true moral conservative wouldn't do. Like a true moral conservative wants to stick around their extended family. And we're actually going to briefly talk about that in a second. You know, I've lived a very liberal life, but the fact is when you have a family, it does make a lot more sense to lean a little bit more right, because actually one thing, and this relates to the Nietzsche stuff that we talked about, or the cultural strategy, if you will, that conservatism is essentially the moral strategy of reduced volatility, right? You want to conserve things the way they are. So all of the morals that are attached to conservatism, and I'm not even going into political issues, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions between the cultural morality that leads to, you know, why conservatives are pro-life or strict borders or whatever the political issue is. Like the conclusion can kind of be obvious when you understand the culture that the cultural paradigm or the moral that leads to it. Conservatism is all about reduced volatility, right? You're not open to a lot of change. You don't want a lot of change. Whereas liberalism, because the cultural root of liberalism is seeking freedom, you have to be open to a lot of things, right? For one, if you're of a subjugated people and many peoples are subjugated or forced into a Bronze Age city by the ruling class, you have to get along with many other cultures. And if you want to overthrow the power, a la the Marxist paradigm, right? You feel oppressed, you want to overthrow the so-called oppressor. You need to, you're not going to be able to fight them hand to hand, right? Because they're the ones with the power. You need to innovate. You need to come up with new ideas that allow you to leverage what you have, right? Whether it's guerrilla warfare that, we've seen since Marxist uprising in the last 100 years, right? Or asymmetrical warfare. You need to look, and then actually, full disclosure, I actually recorded another version of this episode that ended up running 2 hours specifically because I ended up ranting about the Peloponnesian War. So I'm not going to do that too much right now. I actually felt like it was way too long of a tangent. But I'll briefly say, and actually I did a whole episode on this in my History of Man podcast on the Peloponnesian War, specifically on the differences in ideology, what we would now call liberal and conservative between ancient Athens and Sparta. And I'll just briefly say, if you're interested in the history of that, you could check out episode 4 of my History of Man podcast, Two National Characters, I called it, based on a quote, I think by Brasidas, who was a Spartan general. Anyway, the idea is, I'll very briefly say that in the Peloponnesian War, what I found most interesting, other than the actual war fighting, which is interesting in itself, was that Athens, what was unique about Athenian culture versus what was unique about Spartan culture, basically pegged directly into modern day political leftism and political rightism. And you could see that, in terms of how cultural paradigms lead into real outcomes. You can see in the Peloponnesian War, Athens had a very liberal outlook. They were trying all different kinds of innovations. Sparta had a very conservative outlook. They were all about just doing things the hard way and beating the opponents hand to hand. And you can see the pros and cons in the Peloponnesian War, because Sparta had the upper hand in the beginning because they had the better infantry. They were just harder, right? They were all conservatives. Like, as you see in modern day militaries, conservatives are typically the ones in the military. They were just better at fighting. The Athenians couldn't beat them on the battlefield man to man, so they had to innovate. They had to come up with unusual strategies, maneuver warfare that was unusual for the Greeks. So they were taking a more liberal or diverse outlook. So they started getting the upper hand. But then, ironically, actually directly related to the pathogens thing, because Athens was so liberal and they were welcoming all of these different cultures and ideas and peoples from foreign lands, they actually encouraged people to leave the farmlands and come to the city. they literally caused a plague. This strategy of open arms literally caused a plague that almost killed. They almost lost the war because they invited a plague into Athens, and even the general at the time, I'm forgetting his name now, he ended up dying. The guy who had this like diverse policy ended up dying because he welcomed in too many people from the fields, and he literally caught the plague and died. But then the Spartans had to innovate because they were falling behind, and it was a lot of back and forth where you basically see in the Peloponnesian War, the only way to succeed was to have a healthy balance between conservative values and liberal values. Anyways, I did, instead of spending an hour on it, I think I only did 3 minutes on that. If you're interested in the history of that, you could check out episode 4 of the History of Man podcast. But moving on into the relational side of this, what does all of this have to do, all this political stuff, all this cultural stuff, what does it have to do with intimate relationships? What does this have to do with men and women? And we're going to focus on the men's side because, as I mentioned in the intro, it's an unusual trend, at least of the last century, that young men are becoming more conservative. The women becoming more liberal makes a little bit more sense. I mean, simply, there's been a cultural drift left as Western society specifically has become more secular and more abundant. There's been more freedom and resources. And basically, as Western societies have had to worry less about group survival, especially, let's say, since World War II, America being the premier superpower, which maybe is in decline now. People are speculating on that. But like basically, since they had such a supreme military, they had the luxury then of focusing on more liberal things. And you can see this basically in every civilization as the external security needs and survival needs become less of a need. There's now freed resources and attention to focus on interior things. And that is what relates to the male-female dynamic, because as I mentioned in the beginning, and as I mentioned actually in many episodes where I talk about masculine, feminine polarity, every social unit has at least 2 functions as far as their survival, right? And we can actually put it down to survival and reproduction, right? There's the perimeter, the metaphoric perimeter, that someone needs to guard the outside, right? Someone needs to make sure you don't get invaded by other tribes. Someone needs to make sure that you're not being eaten by predators, your children aren't being scooped up, you're not freezing to death due to the cold, you're able to hunt and bring in the right amount of food, of calories to sustain your tribe, your population. And that, as far as we can see from all anthropological evidence, whenever there was enough abundance, that there was enough men in a tribe, right? Just like in Chimp Empire, right? When there wasn't enough men, you see like a mixing of gender roles. But when there are enough men and enough women, the men do that, right? For obvious biological reason. Men have more muscle. Men are predisposed neurologically, as we'll speak, to having that kind of testosterone-driven view of that zero-sum view against hard nature or against enemy tribes or against, catching food. Whereas women, on the other hand, are the opposite, obviously. And for purely practical purposes, women create life in their bodies and men do not. Right. I do think and I don't want to rant too long on this, but it is like one of the things that really frustrates me about feminism. Obviously, I care about women's rights. I have a daughter, I have a wife, and I just care about people, right? If you have a heart, you care about people. I'm not in any way arguing women be oppressed or forced into anything. But the big irony about feminism is that it's so anti-femininity, right? Like feminism, at least like 3rd and 4th wave feminism, encourages women not to be mothers. The most beautiful thing, the most incredible thing that only women can do, which is create life in their bodies, right? Like, it's crazy to me that an ideology that's supposed to fight for women doesn't celebrate the most beautiful thing that women do, right? And anyway, I'm gonna end this rant here. But as far as our anthropological evidence, because women are the more vulnerable sex, and when a woman is pregnant, she's extremely physically vulnerable, it only makes sense that if you're going to make any sort of division of labor, the men deal with the external functions and the women deal with the internal functions. And I would further say that I'm speaking just purely from my own personal anecdotal experience that I assume can be confirmed by other parents, men and women, fathers and mothers, that the interior functions of, say, a family, and this relates, of course, to a tribe, are a totally different mode of being to the dealing with the external functions, right? They're 2 different brains. It's like, obviously, a human being is capable of a wide range of activities, right? Some of us are better at certain things and better at the other things, but to switch between, I'll speak for myself, dealing with money in the outside world and scheduling and, security, be it metaphoric or literal, versus being there for the emotional needs of my children. I mean, I do my best to do both, right? I spend a lot of time with my kids too, and I love it, but they're two different brains. Like it's hard to think about survival needs and be there emotionally for my kids. Like they're two like totally different switches. I actually think like, my brain when I drink coffee is so not conducive to being an emotionally available father. Because when I drink coffee, and I'm speaking for myself, I don't know if my cortisol levels rise. Like I really want to focus on abstractions. I really want to think about life plans or what I'm going to say on a podcast or, envisioning future things or threat detection, if you will. It's like a more conservative or like it's a more convergent style of thinking. Like I really want to focus and go deep on specific, usually abstract ideas. And I know when I drink a cup of coffee, it's much more, I'm not as good a father, right? I'm not as emotionally available to my kid. Whereas on the flip side, and I'm not, advocating for substance use, especially around kids, but if I take a hit of a joint, if I smoke a little cannabis, it's totally the opposite. Right? Like I don't want to think so much about the outside, or I don't want to focus so much on I don't want to think convergently or focus deeply on a specific subject. I just want to be present. Right. And Joe Rogan actually has a bit on this, which is actually maybe the reason why I've ever, been a little bit high around my kid before, is that like if I smoke a little bit and I don't, anyway, whatever it is, what it is, I can so enter my 2-year-old's world. Like I can so empathize with her in a way that is a little bit more challenging normally and very challenging if I drink coffee. So anyway, this is my point is like, even though we are not living in Paleolithic tribes, obviously modern people, modern men and women can choose to take on whatever role or do whatever they want. I want my daughter to, if she wants to be a housewife, great. If she wants to work in corporate, that's also great. I'm not advocating for any kind of societal enforcement of gender roles. However, one of the reasons why I become more conservative and more in favor of this, and why my wife and I chose to be this way, where, I take care of the money and I take care of external things, and she's, with the children a lot more than me, is mainly because they're two different modes of being. We can say liberal and conservative or masculine and feminine modes of being, and it's very hard to switch. Like when one can focus on a specific thing, they can become a lot better at it. Anyways. So again, like looking at why women have become more liberal, it's a little bit easier to see, again, with the cultural drift that I just went on a tangent about. But also, even if you take on the Marxist lens, pretty objectively, if you look at 5,000 years, I'm using feminist terminology now. If you look at the last 5,000 years of civilization, women have been in the underclass, right? Comparing this to the Nietzsche lens, women have been they've been less autonomous, right? Most civils, pretty much every culture, as far back as we can, as we have records of, have been patriarchal in the sense, not that they've necessarily oppressed women, but because men have been in charge of dealing with the perimeter and the exterior values. And for most of human history, until basically more modernized civilization, external threat was a big deal, right? Like you really needed to prioritize making sure you didn't get eaten by predators, conquered by another tribe, that you survived against the harsh elements. Maternity and creating life was important too, but if all the women were pregnant but the men couldn't hold down their end of the bargain, if they couldn't protect the perimeter and you all got consumed, or you all got, the men were all killed and the women were abducted by the new tribe, that culture wouldn't exist anymore. So it was natural, let's say, or like, game theory optimal, if you will, that most cultures, especially cultures in harsh environments, let's say in environments where there's a lot of war between tribes or like limited resources where the tribes were often trying to kill each other just to survive, they became a little bit more skewed and more patriarchal because you needed to emphasize security more than life, because then the life wouldn't exist. Whereas if you look at ancient cultures that were a little bit more egalitarian, or maybe even celebrated women more than men, or they celebrated motherhood, if you look at like some of the ancient let's say fertility cults, those could only exist when there was no outside threat or very little outside threat, where like you didn't have to emphasize hypermasculinity so much because you didn't, there wasn't a reason for it, right? Like you weren't worried about your survival or being attacked from the outside. Therefore, you could focus more to feminine values. And this is essentially true in the relationship, but also the nation. It's like only when the border or the perimeter, metaphoric or literal, is secure, do you have the luxury of focusing on internal values. So anyway, I keep going on tangents, but back to why have young men become more conservative? Because again, this is kind of unusual if you look at the trends generation by generation. Now, an anecdote before I go into other reasoning, something I just noticed, I do jujitsu. I love martial arts. I follow a lot of MMA fighters and jujitsu practitioners, and I forget whom, but there's a bunch of famous jujitsu guys who also are very political and post a lot of right-wing things. And I've seen, I sometimes read the comments, and there's a lot of people who are like, why are all jujitsu guys right-wing? And I think this is an interesting question, and it also ties into everything in this episode of there does seem to be something that when a man takes on what is essentially a hyper-masculine activity, or an archetypal masculine activity, which is fighting, right? Or learning to fight, or training to fight, or training to be strong. There's this natural inclination towards merit-based hierarchies, right? Like in a jiu-jitsu gym, you have belt levels, right? And there's a certain respect that comes with it. There's obviously the culture in martial arts is about respect, but there's also a practical respect because typically who can beat up whom, right? On the mats or in competition, this is true for all sports actually, where there's a winner and a loser. There's a concreteness of who's better than whom based on the end of the results of a match or the results of a game, right? And there's a certain respect that comes with that you can't fake, right? It's different than courtesy in, let's say, a situation where either you get participation trophies or there's not really competition. It's like when there's real competition, when there's real zero-sum competition and a hierarchy develops on, this is the guy that can beat everyone up, or this is the black belt who earned his black belt through being good at jujitsu or whatever the thing is. It's true for all sports, right? There's this natural respect for, again, quote Shapiro, facts over feelings, right? In competition, in a real competition where you're actually keeping score, it doesn't really matter what your intentions were. It doesn't really matter how people feel. It's not the most important thing. What matters are the concrete results. And I do think men are predisposed to this for all the reasons we've said about, Paleolithic division of labor. But also this mode of being, if you are doing something hard like jujitsu and slowly progressing up the rankings, if you will, or slowly becoming better, you start everyone at the gym beats you up. And then after 6 months, you can kind of hang with the other white belts. And, after a couple of years, you get promoted to blue belt and you can kind of handle all the beginners. This kind of respect for merit-based hierarchy, again, ties itself to what Nietzsche would call master morality, or we can, bring downstream to conservative politics. And I do think the political side of this and why, there's so many fighters who are all about Trump. Actually, if you watch UFC, it's kind of, it's just an interesting, I think, media move that Trump comes to almost all of the American UFC pay-per-views and he waves his hand, everyone cheers. It's people who like fighting seem to like conservative politics, and they kind of just mesh together, again, as evolutionary strategy goes. I do think the one thing I will say specifically about politics is that because of the leftward cultural drift, and I would actually say, this was a big error of the political left of the last, let's say, decade. And I'm not even, anyway, I'll just leave it at that, is that since they went so extreme and so hard in criticizing anyone who wasn't left enough as being fascist or whatever. I don't even want to go too deep into all of this because it's not really my point to dwell on the political specifics. But because they went so hard on this, they have forced a lot of young men, especially during Me Too. Actually, this is the most maybe concrete example of so many young men feeling, the toxic masculinity or masculinity being demonized. So many men have been wait a minute, I'm not an asshole. You're saying I need to act a certain way, or I need to act more feminine, and that's not serving me, or or the typical nice guy thing of boys being raised to be softer and more feminine. And then they hit puberty and realize that women are not attracted to that. They're attracted to the opposite. Actually, they want the bad boy. They want the one who says no to the liberal collective ideology. This causes resentment, obviously. And I think as a correction, a lot of young men have shifted further right. And I brought this up with a recent guest. I think he'll releases episode soon, Joshua Lysek, where I'm actually pretty liberal still when it comes to most things. I mean, I'm a 2001 liberal, right? Now I might be considered conservative based on the shifting of the Overton window, but, I'm still, I believe in freedom and all of that stuff, right? Like personal freedom and personal autonomy, like adults should do whatever the hell they want. That's as long as they're not hurting people. Generally my deeper moral worldview. But one thing that's made me, aside from becoming a father and my real life incentives changing, one thing that has made me shift a little bit right is that and I use Jordan Peterson as an example. Like, if you've heard me speak about Jordan Peterson on this podcast, I like a lot of the things he has to say, specifically about how he validates the young male emotional experience in a way that culture doesn't. But I don't agree with a lot of things he says. Like, he's way more conservative than me in many things, and I don't think he understands women, and I don't think, I don't agree with a lot of his advice. But I often defend Jordan Peterson specifically because the extreme left went so over the top in demonizing him. It's like, yeah, he's a conservative that believes in certain things, but like they went so over the top in demonizing him that whereas if they didn't do that, I'd probably be like, oh yeah, Jordan Peterson, I like some of his stuff. I don't like some of his stuff. Because they demonized him so hard, and it seems so egregious and so inaccurate. I was like, wait a minute, you guys are wrong about Jordan Peterson. He's not a Nazi. He's not this evil person. Like even his Wikipedia page, like made him seem so terrible. And he's really not. Like he's just a conservative dude, right? And you could see a lot of this with like, I'm afraid to even mention, I'm not even afraid, but like, I don't really want to go in this direction. But like, if you look at a lot of the independent support of Trump nowadays, I'm sure that a lot of this, from a propaganda perspective, came from the fact that the left so like over the top hyperbolically demonized him that people who were kind of in the middle were like, wait, he's not that bad, right? Like, maybe you don't like some of the things he says or some of his policies. Obviously, he's a Republican. And if you don't like that, then you can maybe not like him. But like to so grossly demonize him in a way so over the top, the left has actually created more support in him. Anyways, I keep going off on tangents, and I don't want this episode to be too long, but back to why young men are becoming more conservative. That is one thing. I do think it's a bit of a correction against the left pushing everyone a little bit too far left, that people who we can say biologically or morally don't fit that have pulled back right, just as a correction. But there is also the biological basis of, and again with martial arts, and I've mentioned this in other episodes speaking about young men, I've seen this a lot with teenage boys in martial arts where a young man starts going through puberty, his testosterone rises, he feels like this euphoria, this like, this powerfulness that he didn't feel as a 11-year-old boy. And you see a lot of young men try jiu-jitsu for the first time, and there's a kind of machismo that comes with it. A guy who's never been tested, thinking, "Oh, I'm going to learn how to fight." And I've seen this a lot. I think because I'm an older guy. I mean, I'm in my 30s, but I'm not physically big. And I've seen a lot of teenage boys who are new to jiu-jitsu, like try to go really hard against me, maybe to prove something, like maybe that they can beat up the blue belt. But then, of course, like I actually know jiu-jitsu, so I'm able to handle these guys, these young men, despite their machismo, usually. And you can see that their whole demeanor shifts. Like there's something in a young man that really wants to be contained by a stronger man. And I do think this is like the solution to helping like rambunctious or like belligerent or aggressive teenage boys. Is like many of them need to, get in touch with their feelings more, learn how to be vulnerable, all of that stuff that you would see in like, any, more feminine driven personal development perspective. But they need to be handled. A young man on like a deep primal level, and then there's evolutionary roots to this too, wants to be humbled by a man who's more competent than them or stronger than them, right? And I can see this in teenage boys who like once they can see like, okay, I can handle them, not only is there a respect that comes, but there's kind of a love. And I've this is hard to describe to, I think neurotypical women might have a hard time understanding this, or someone who's never really played sports or combat sports might have a hard time understanding this, but it's like this kind of beautiful experience, this kind of beautiful male vulnerability that you don't see. And I've actually seen this, like, because I've done jujitsu in many countries where I don't speak the language. Like recently in Mexico, like there's a bunch of like I think high school age or like maybe early 20s young men who fit this. Like where like I would humble them on the mats. And I'm not saying this to brag. I've just been doing jujitsu for a long time, or longer than a white belt, right? I would humble them on the mats. And even though we couldn't really speak, because my Spanish is very good, I saw this in Thailand too. I don't speak Thai very well. Even wordlessly, there was this kind of like deep love and respect, like this big brother love, or even like, maybe father-sonly love that these young men would feel when humbled by a man who's objectively better at fighting than them, right? And there's this thing of like, I do think on this primal level, men, neurotypical men, masculine men, testosterone-driven beings want to be contained. Like they want to be in a merit-based hierarchy. Yes, feelings are important too, but feelings are only important after the facts are handled to a neurotypical male. And actually, I'll just say like he's an Instagrammer, but also a YouTuber. He's been on Joe Rogan. His name is Jason Wilson. I believe if I'm remembering correctly, I think he has a gym in Harlem or some inner city, right? He his gym is full of like many like young black kids that are in the inner city, where life is tough, and like he teaches them martial arts. And there's a bunch of clips that like bring me to tears, like they make me bawl because he'll go into these like deep emotional lessons with young boys and teenage boys about like how they need to feel their feelings and all of that stuff. But it only comes after they've done push-ups, or after they've confronted the realities of winning and losing while in sparring. And there's something like, I don't know if I could even articulate well enough. I would just suggest anyone, especially any guy who wants to like maybe find something that would really make you cry. I think it would make men cry and not women so much, because there's something about like the vulnerability of strength, or the vulnerability of the reality of men being on the metaphoric or literal perimeter sometimes. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. And move more into the solutions now, because again, even though this is my reshoot, this is already looking like a long episode. Last point on this actually is that all of this stuff, these what we're now calling politically conservative values, but have an evolutionary root, comes from the war band, right? If you are a man serving in the war band, a group of men where the ancient version of locker talk might exist, there is a culture where things like honor, strength, merit, and facts over feelings matter, because that is your role. And that is why that all exists. Anyway, going back to the social stuff, another statistic that is tied, I don't think it was in the Economist article, but a lot of people have shared this article, or a lot of people have talked about this idea of this political gender split. And one of the statistics that's thrown around is that amongst Gen Z women, 55% of women who were polled in this poll find listening to Joe Rogan to be a red flag, which I think is very interesting too, because first of all, if you've actually listened to Joe Rogan, he's not actually that conservative, right? He believes in certain morals that might be lumped in with conservative ideology, but he's actually, it's, I think, similar to me, and similar, I think, to most moderates, generally liberal, but again, the left has demonized him because he wasn't left-leaning enough. But anyway, I'm not even going to, I don't want to talk about directly politics anymore. Joe Rogan appeals to so many young men. I think he gets like 11 million downloads per episode. So it's actually, what's interesting is that even though mainstream media, especially on the left, tends to demonize him as, being this fringe, weird podcaster, if we go off on the assumption that people tend to consume the media that confirms their beliefs, the fact that Joe Rogan has many times more downloads or many times more viewers than any show on cable news, be it in Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, like he's like so much further, we can assume that Joe Rogan actually represents most people. The Joe Rogan audience, despite all the aliens talk and conspiracy theories and all this stuff that's easy to criticize or laugh about, he actually represents people's worldview more than any CNN show or Fox News show, which I think is worth pointing out. But one of the things that, I think is the crux of Joe Rogan's appeal, it's not that he's like, the smartest guy. He's not like sharing like deep Jungian principles or anything. His appeal is ethos, right? If you look at the three types of persuasion in according to Greek oratory, right? Pathos, the emotional appeal. David Goggins is kind of a pathos guy. He's like, he riles you up to like put your shoes on and go running or do more pull-ups, right? It's all emotional. Jordan Peterson's more of a logos guy. He's sharing like deep concepts or new perspectives. They're all intellectual. Joe Rogan is simply an ethos guy, right? Ethos is character, right? What's interesting about Joe Rogan's interviews is that people talk to him differently than they talk to other people. And you can see this with like anyone who's been on a lot of podcasts, you know, whether it's an intellectual like Andrew Huberman or Jordan Peterson, or an athlete, an MMA fighter, or a comedian, which Joe Rogan has a lot of fighters and comedians on, right? They talk to Joe Rogan differently than they talk to some other interviewer, right? Even if Joe was to ask the same exact questions, right? They talk to him differently. Why? Because people respect, men, I think especially, highly respect who Joe Rogan is as a person. The fact that he's a jiu-jitsu black belt, the fact that he's built like this big media empire, the fact that he, you know, even if you disagree with his stuff, like he's really principled. He really follows certain things. Like, you know, even though he's not necessarily an advice giver, he does give like kind of this practical, lived, almost blue collar advice of like, do hard things, conquer your inner bitch. And I think this more than anything, more than the content of what he says, the character that he represents, and who knows, maybe behind closed doors, he's like a total fake. And I don't know, I've never met the guy, right? None of us, most of us who listen to him haven't. He represents a certain kind of character that is refreshing to young men, specifically for all the reasons that I said. Just the fact that he espouses the virtue of doing hard things and, you know, not taking shit, but also being emotionally aware and caring about freedom and looking at things in other ways. Anyway, I think this is telling. And the statistic that 55% of Gen Z women consider listening to Joe Rogan a red flag, I think that's simply unfortunate. And it's simply a point where politicized propaganda, I mean, that's kind of an anyway, that's kind of a redundant statement, right? Propaganda is politicized. But propaganda has kind of skewed the opposite side, where, you know, a militant feminist might assume that listening to Joe Rogan, which is not even, you know, that it's not a political podcast, is somehow a red flag, is unfortunate, because it is a sign in our society that we have forgotten how to appreciate the other side, right? You know, my wife listens to Joe Rogan once in a while, but I don't think she resonates with it, because as we're getting into, bringing into, you know, the end bit of our episode here, women are primed to be more liberal, right? Like, I don't think she, you know, I mentioned this in other episodes, like, but a couple of years ago, I think inspired by Goggins being on Joe Rogan, you know, a bunch of friends of mine and I decided to do this David Goggins inspired challenge, the 4x4x48 challenge, where we ran 4 kilometers every 4 hours for 40 hours. We ended up walking a lot of it because none of us were used to running long distance, you know, jogging. And our girlfriends just didn't quite understand. My wife respected it, right? And this is going to tie us into you know, our last part of how to create harmony in a polarized setting, relationship, or nation. My wife respected it. My wife respected that I was doing this hard thing, but she would never do that. And some of my friends' girlfriends, like, they just didn't understand, like, why would you do that? Like, why would you put yourself through such discomfort, and you're not even training for anything, or not, like, there's no concrete purpose. But like, for any neurotypical man, it's kind of obvious why you would choose to do something. Just for the sake of going hard, right? Like, just for this evolutionary, you know, archetypal masculine thing of like, doing hard things despite discomfort is somehow in itself valuable, is a masculine value. We're bringing this into the last part of like, okay, we've laid out the biological basis of conservatism and liberalism. We've tied this into neurotypical males and females for evolutionary reasons. Now, how do you create harmony? How do you create harmony between two types of people who are primed to view the world in different ways, and for good reason? Actually, one more anecdote about my family. My wife and I are very ideologically aligned, but behaviorally, she is very feminine, and I'm much more masculine. Like, I go more into this coffee brain, and she's more empathic, and then like that is how we best serve our family, right? Like, when she and I first started, I mean, when we became serious, you know, I just told her, I'm just going to pay for everything, right? And it was actually funny. It was kind of in an argument. Like, I didn't even mean it as like this grand gesture, but we were, I don't remember. I was stressed that day about something. We'd gone to the supermarket, we had a grocery bill, and it's like we had to split the bill. And I'm like, man, I'm tired of splitting this bill. Like, I don't want to spend our time like splitting an $80 bill. I knew I had a lot more money than her. I was just like, I'm just going to pay for everything. And we're already kind of talking about, do we want to have children in the near future? We ended up getting pregnant like 2 months later by accident. But I'm just like, fuck it. Like, I'm just going to pay for everything. And she cried, right? And she burst into tears. I didn't even mean it as a grand gesture. She burst into tears because she actually said, like, that felt like me asking to marry her. Like, I was committing my resources to her. And I didn't even think of it that way, right? And then I'm not even saying that, like, this is not like a prescription that, every family needs to have traditional gender roles, or the man needs to protect and provide and the women needs to be the kids. And that was a choice that we made for now. I mean, my wife is, she's still writing her book and she's still doing work, but like her primary thing is taking care of the children. But I will say, and this is something I do believe in, so I'm just sharing, I'm not telling everyone else to do this. And obviously if you live in an expensive area, maybe it's not possible to have a one income household, but I can see how I don't have any resentment when it comes to me paying for everything, right? Or me provide, it's like, I feel honored to be able to give this gift to my wife where she doesn't have to think about the outside world, right? It's not that she's not capable of doing it. She ran a successful business and she still, she still works. She's still a great coach. She's still, it's not like she can't do this, but like, I feel it's this important gift that I give her. We're given that, child rearing and caring about the interior of a social unit versus the exterior and the external needs of a social unit are such different brains. There's such different modes of being. I feel it's a really important gift that I give her, that she doesn't have to worry about money. She doesn't have to worry about external survival. And therefore, she's able to be in a more feminine mode, if you will. She's being able to be in a more feeling-based mode that an entrepreneur or someone dealing with money doesn't have the luxury of, right? Like you can't, if you have to put food on the table, you can't just be like, oh, well, my feelings dictate this other thing. Whereas being a mother and being, with children and caring about the internal needs of a home, feelings should be more important than facts, right? So the reverse of Shapiro's statement is that in certain settings, it's very important for feelings to take precedent over facts, specifically with little children, right? Like I'm actually guilty of this in many ways that I'm not proud of, where like, I'm kind of a little bit too focused on the practicalities sometimes. And I can see how it doesn't make me the best father at times, right? Like, I'm focused on other things, but like when I'm actually with my daughter, for instance, I've honestly lost my cool in more times than I would like to admit, because I was still in kind of like externally focused, testosterone driven brain. And I don't have the patience for my daughter when she's having an irrational moment about feeling about something that I just think is, and my wife, and I appreciate this about her, is that she's kind of policed me. She's the more feeling person, the more empathic person, the more empathic adult in our household. She's reminded me not to, I have raised my voice when I really shouldn't have, right? And I love that. Actually, we were speaking about this the other night that, I'm working on, maintaining my patience when our 2-year-old is being in her terrible 2 moments, right? But if the situation was reversed, if my wife was the yeller who like lost her cool and became like overly harsh and I had to be the soft one, there would be something weird about that, right? At least for the fact that I'm a neurotypical man and she's a neurotypical woman. Like there'd be something weird about that if I had to emphasize empathy and feelings and she was the one who would kind of go into her head. Like there would be something like, I think, unnatural about it. And obviously every relationship is unique and, there are masculine women and feminine men and they usually, there's nothing wrong with that, right? If something works, it works, right? I'm not trying to, proclaim that these are the ways that men and women have to behave. But I know for us, and I think for almost all, I would just say all neurotypical men and neurotypical women, there was, it just wouldn't work. Like it is just so much more in line with our natural tendencies for her to be more focused on feelings, as most women tend to be, and for me to be more focused on facts. And we need each other for those reasons, specifically when raising a family together, because just like a nation, there are internal needs and there are external needs. All right, bringing us into our final part of how do you create harmony? And I'm going to do more episodes on different aspects of this, but I do want to lay out a framework, or I would say the framework that I offer men when they reach out to me, when they have relationship issues, when there's specifically issues with a not unified reality where the, let's say, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend are not on the same page. And this became, I witnessed this a lot in different relationships when it came to what happened during the pandemic. I'm almost afraid to say the virus. Say that word because will YouTube flag me? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, the YouTube algorithm doesn't like me very much, so I guess it doesn't matter. But something was revealed, I think, in a lot of even long-term relationships and marriage where maybe things seemed fine until you got to the point where there was a concrete reason to decide on your worldview. And not even to get into the specifics of the pandemic, but there's obviously many opposing worldviews floating around, and they became politicized as many things seem to be in this era, whether it's view on mandates or even, like people kept saying maybe on both sides, but one side specifically kept saying, trust the science about things that were not scientifically proven. And then, without even going into my personal views, like basically you had two versions of science or two versions of scientific beliefs, which is, very ironic, right? Actually, South Park did a satire on something very related to this, like 20 years ago, I think, or 15 years ago. I think it was when I was in college. It was about I don't even remember, like there was some season where they went to the future and like instead of religion, basically people divided science into different religious, like quasi-religious factions where each side was saying like, our science is the one true science. And they were basically arguing over religious ideas, but calling it science. And you saw the same thing happen in the pandemic. Anyways, a number of men reached out to me where this was the catalyst for realizing there was something wrong in the relationship, because he had a certain view of the global events when it came to this disease or the things that were happening on with public policy, and his wife, his partner, had a totally different viewpoint. And as I'm saying, I do think on some level it's natural for men to have a more conservative outlook and women to have a more liberal outlook. But what was really revealed, like if the guy was like against mandates and the woman was for mandates, what it really revealed, more than the political divide, was that they were not in the same reality. And I would even take this a step further, and this is something I talk about in other episodes on relationship polarity, so I'll say it more briefly here, is that, or actually even just fitting in with our entire model of this episode, of like how it is natural for the people who are on the interior of society, whereas the women of a Paleolithic tribe, or in maybe a more controversial view, the underclass of a society, whoever's on the interior, whoever's like inside the perimeter that's being handled by the other group, it is natural, based on the social incentives and maybe even biological incentives, to go along with the reality or to entrust in the reality set by the perimeter setter, because the people on the perimeter, be it the men or the men of a tribe, or again, in the more controversial example, the ruling class, they're the ones who are in charge of interfacing with the outside world. So it makes sense that they would set the reality, whereas the people on the interior, whether it's the women, the children, the underclass, they're going off of what the perimeter setters go on. And in a healthy society, right? Now, if you could take this in many negative ways, and we are going to address the oppressed situation. But in a healthy society, whether it's a healthy polarized relationship or a healthy pre-civilization tribe, there is a mutual trust where those on the interior have good reason to entrust their external survival or the external needs or the external aspects of their survival to whoever the perimeter setter is, whether you call it the authority or not, right? Like in a typical pre-civilization tribe, the chief was the primary or the chief perimeter setter, right? Like he was in charge of most of the perimeter, metaphorically, right? In ancient tribes or like, small groups before lots of specialization of roles, the true alpha male of the group was kind of in charge of everything. Like he basically took on, for example, the Bronze Age Greeks. So before, what we think of as the ancient Greeks, like the Mycenaean Greeks, the Greeks of the Trojan War, that are talked about in the Iliad. Their social system was that every city, I mean, they called them cities now, but like, basically town, like the village, had what was known as a wanax. I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly. This is ancient, like a previous version of Greek, a more ancient version of Greek. He was in some ways elected, not democratically elected, but he had proven himself as the most competent man. And he was in charge of everything. He was the chief, he was the shaman, he ran the religious rites, he made the military decisions, he made the decisions about what the group should do collectively because he earned that position. He was entrusted because he was both competent and benevolent. And he also determined what I call the spiritual perimeter, which is how are we going to perceive the outside world? And in a healthy society, he proved himself as worthy of all of the dependents entrusting him with that, because he proved himself as competent and benevolent, right? He was able to handle the outside world. He was able to lead the war band in military victories or the hunting band. He was able to lead the spiritual religious rites that had the group bond around a mythology. He was competent and he was benevolent. Like he didn't abuse his power. He did this in a way that he served them. So it was in everyone's interest to trust him and listen to him and you know, and basically collectivize or unify under his leadership. Now you bring this into the two-person relationship, and you know, and I realize this maybe is a controversial statement, and you know, perhaps a feminist would get upset about this. And I just want to say, like, I understand why feminism, even though you know it kind of devalues motherhood and masculinizes women very ironically, like feminism runs on very patriarchal, testosterone-driven values. Like just the idea that it's somehow better for a young girl to aspire to be a partner in a law firm than it is to be a mother and you know, have many kids and take care of them. Like just the idea that is more valuable than the former is more valuable than the latter is so anti-womanhood. I know this is a man me saying this, but I'm going off of also what my wife tells me and other women that I know who love being mothers. It is natural for a person in that state, because of pregnancy, let's say, like the most biological thing, the fact that a woman is so physically vulnerable and emotionally vulnerable, right? Like, you know, pregnancy brain is a real thing, right? My breastfeeding brain is a real thing. My wife jokes about it a lot. A lot of her friends who are young mothers joke about it a lot. It's like, it is harder to keep track of things like schedules and abstractions and externally focused things when a child is literally taking milk out of your body, or you're growing a child in your belly. Like, it forces you into a more feeling-based state. And I really feel for single mothers for this reason, because it is the most natural thing in the world for a person who goes specifically into the most hyper feminine state of pregnancy or child, like, you know, young child rearing, to need a benevolent, competent, masculine presence to deal with the other stuff for them, because like it's a totally different brain again. It's a totally different mode of being. And again, I realize, you know, with feminism, there's a reason for feminism. Men have men have historically or collectively failed women and then not holding up their end of the bargain of being competent enough to handle their perimeter and also benevolent enough where they're actually taking care of the woman and not abusing the power entrusted to them. But I also know, maybe another reason why I've become a little bit more conservative is that over the years of coaching couples, and this is even true for gay couples, right? You know, because you see, even though it's sometimes more fluid with a gay couple, there typically is someone who's more masculine and more feminine. Like these polarized roles are kind of wired into us. You know, even in a non-reproductive scenario, such as, you know, a gay relationship. But especially with hetero relationships, every woman that I've come across, even women who are like ideologically feminist or ideologically believe in egalitarianism or men and women being exactly the same, when it comes down to it, when it comes to real intimacy or what goes on in the bedroom and gives the genuine arousal response, or what makes a person feel safe and loved, and I would specifically say with women, every time that the woman was not severely traumatized or, like, you know, was really hurt by men letting her down when she was younger. In every other case, women seem to want to be nested within the perimeter of a man whom she truly can trust because he's competent and benevolent to handle the perimeter for her. It doesn't mean that, you know, they have to go into traditional gender roles or anything like that, but that 100% of the time seems to be true. And, you know, as I've spoken about in episodes where I speak more about the arousal response, almost all the time, this is what makes a woman feel sexy, makes a woman feel aroused. It's not where she also has to, like, defend the perimeter and look out. Actually, you know, I've referenced the study in other episodes, but like a woman can't enter a full state of orgasm by herself, right? Rutgers did a study on this, right? Like the amygdala does not shut off when a woman is stimulating herself, is basically masturbating herself to orgasm. Whereas only when she's having an orgasm with a partner, only then is her amygdala able to turn off. Basically, her threat detection is to turn off because subconsciously, let's say, she trusts that her partner is taking care of the perimeter. So she can fully go deep into pleasure. She can fully go deep into a feeling state and have a full pleasurable orgasmic experience. All right, so back to the advice, and I'm going to keep this kind of short, and I'll do another episode maybe going deeper into the steps. But when a guy reaches out to me, such as these gentlemen who've reached out to me, recognizing that there was a political divide, or, you know, they weren't in the same spiritual perimeter as revealed during the pandemic, I basically offer a 3-stage process, right? It's fairly simple. It's not necessarily easy, which is again why I'm now creating a group coaching program for men in this, because we would go through these stages together with personalized help. And obviously everyone's relationship's a little bit different, and every man is a little bit different. He might be in a different situation, and he might need specifics of specific coaching, but also specific suggestion. But the process is essentially the same, specifically for people who recognize, or I would say men who recognize, that him and his partner are not on the same page, or she isn't really in his perimeter. And again, it doesn't matter what your chosen roles are in your family or a relationship, but I do feel it's extremely important in a masculine-feminine relationship, in a hetero relationship with neurotypical people, for this dynamic to exist, for you to really have unity and have both people be able to basically play to their evolutionary characteristics, meaning they'll end up feeling valued, loved, respected, and do what they do best. So the first stage is looking at the man as an individual. Are you behaving in a way where you are truly worthy of respect, where it really honestly makes sense? If you take a hard look at yourself, does it make sense for another person, your partner or whomever, to truly surrender within your perimeter, to really trust you to handle the external world for them, at least in part? And often the answer, when a man really looks at himself, if he doesn't have like a healthy dynamic, a loving dynamic, an intimate dynamic with his wife, even if they're courteous to each other, that often is not fulfilled when he takes a good look, because courtesy is a social and a chosen or a conscious expression, right? You choose to be courteous. I think I'm actually quoting Jordan Peterson by accident here. But respect is a primal emotion, right? Respect can't be faked. You can act courteous without respecting to someone, but respect is a primal emotion that is earned. And with people, and I would say in many cases on primal social relating, but I would specifically say with how a woman feels towards a man, how a woman's sexual response or intimate response or love response, her reproductive instincts, how they respond to a man, it is just as primal. I mean, it is tied directly to respect, because the question I would ask a guy is like, do you really respect yourself? Like, would you follow you? Would you recommend that, if you were being objective and you saw a man who behaved exactly like you, would you think it would be a good idea for your daughter to truly entrust her security to you? Both emotional security and really emotional security is the bigger thing, because, if you live in a developed nation, day-to-day survival is not something you're worried about, right? But it's like emotional security as a proxy for material security. Like, is that really a thing? So that first phase is essentially the man working on himself to ensure, like, are you really doing the right things? Or to use the 12-step phrase, is your side of the street clean? Before you care at all about your partner's behavior, are you acting in a way that's truly worthy of respect? And if not, how do you work on that? And a lot of those things ultimately do end up being kind of archetypal masculine, or like we might even say like the Joe Rogan conservative values. Like, are you doing hard things? Are you keeping physically fit? Like, your wife might not care about things like sports or physical prowess, especially if she has a more liberal outlook. Actually, a friend just told me this, a friend who kind of had this shift from being very politically liberal to very politically conservative. He was saying to me, like, when he was living like the hyper liberal life of being an activist and, living by a very Marxist ideology, and all his friend group was that, at some point he realized, he was kind of miserable, and he started listening to Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan inspired him to start working out, and he had to work out in secret because he knew that his friends would shame him as doing something toxically masculine. By trying to physically make his body stronger. But the thing is, all of this ideological stuff is that ideology is on the surface, or it is downstream from this primal nature. And even someone who is ideologically opposed to men prioritizing getting fit, or, criticizes anyone in the gym as a meathead, everyone on the primal level respects a man who betters his body. Everyone, right? Even the most anti-masculine, or like a woman who's like deeply wounded by the masculine, has a lot of trauma, like hates when guys like take on alpha characteristics or try to be physically strong, she will still respect you, even, maybe even respect you more. Like, and I'm just imagining, I think of a few couples that I've been acquainted with or briefly coached, like where the woman would even shame the man for getting up early to lift weights. She will still respect him. Deep down, she will still respect him, because respect, just like the sexual arousal response, is so deep and so primal that it doesn't matter. It can override whatever the ideological perspective is. Actually, tied to this statistic about Gen Z women finding it a red flag when men listen to Joe Rogan. I've seen some like female conservative pundits share this idea, or share these like clips of liberal women who are liberal feminist women who felt conflicted that they found conservative ideology to be so distasteful, and yet they were only attracted to conservative men. And I'm not trying to defend any political position, but it does point again to the primal side of this, is that even when the ideologies don't match, even when a person thinks, oh, I want to be with a man who's deeply in touch with his emotions and, will treat me exactly the same and like wants men and women to be the same, even when she wants that ideologically, there's still primal characteristics where a neurotypical woman is going to respect archetypal male traits. Even if her mind doesn't believe it, her body is going to respond to that. It's still somehow more attractive when a man works out and opens doors for women and offers to pay, even if she's not into that. Anyway, this is the point. Going back to this first phase, is like, if you take on the things that you as a man would have you genuinely respect yourself, or genuinely respect these traits in another man, when you do that, not only is that something that any woman will, with whether she likes it or not, she's going to respect it, or any person will respect it. It's also the most important prerequisite, because all other relationship tactics, whether they're overt or covert, they need to start with self-esteem. And what is great or simple about self-esteem, even though it's not easy necessarily, is that, especially as a man, this may or may not be true for women. Like, a woman would have to answer that. I know this is true for men. When you do hard things that you would respect in other people, you ultimately respect in yourself. And therefore, it's a lot easier to have a backbone. It's a lot easier to deal with, like I've coached a number of people, both men and women, who've dated men and women with like serious narcissistic tendencies, even though I don't like labeling disorders, right? And very often, I'll specifically say for the men who are like tolerating narcissistic, in quotes, abuse from their partner, when they started doing harder things and really respecting themselves, they didn't need some tactic for dealing with the narcissism. They just started respecting themselves, and like the narcissistic tactics or like the behaviors kind of just didn't work anymore. Anyway, that's kind of an extreme. And that's not the case in most relationships, but that is the prerequisite. Anyway, phase two, and I'll move through this a bit quickly. Phase two are then what we might call, and I might come up with a better term for this, but like the covert tactics of like, before you go into like the deep discussion, or maybe concurrently with having the discussion of like, let's talk about our relationship and let's talk about how we can make our needs, before you take it overt and explicit, there has to be certain behavioral things that incentivize a woman to trust in your reality, because this is not about brainwashing. This is not about convincing someone to see view the world politically like you. Actually, the deeper thing, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, is that a neurotypical woman, given that she is biologically primed to want to be in the perimeter of a man whom she trusts, or, an authority figure she trusts, she's naturally primed to take on the reality of that person, or she'll stop caring, right? Like, I know relationships where, they're super happily married, and the man is more conservative in his outlook, and like maybe he votes Republican and she votes Democrat, and they're not like really on the same page, or maybe they playfully argue about the stuff, but they're so emotionally unified that it doesn't matter. Right? It's like so like who they vote for is so secondary or tertiary to their shared reality, where she trusts him when it comes to the important things. Maybe she doesn't like who he votes for, or they kind of argue, or like they tease each other about it, but they're unified and they're harmonious, and where she so trusts him as a man, then when it comes to stuff that really affects their relationship and their family, she's more than willing to, for the most part, defer to him. It's not that like the person in the feminine or the interior position blindly follows, right? We're not talking about some oppressive situation, but like she might give him feedback. She might tell him, just like my wife gives me like kind of harsh feedback sometimes when when I raise my voice with the kids when I really shouldn't, right? Like that's important feedback. She still trusts me, right? Like it's a healthy relationship when the woman trusts the man to deal with the outside, and the same with the man trusts the woman to deal with the interior. So the second phase, after basic self-esteem and self-respect and the man doing the right things on his own, living the right way as a man, is handled, the next point is, are you being now like looking at this from a group perspective? If you are in charge of the perimeter, whether she like explicitly trusts you or not, again, whether or not you have the explicit gender roles, however you want it to do things, right? It's your choice. Are you taking on the primal masculine role as the perimeter setter, where you are looking at the needs of the entire group, the two-person relationship or the family if you have children? Are you genuinely looking at the needs of the group and making decisions that are best for everyone, right? That first part, handling yourself, is basically the competence part. Are you competent enough to handle the perimeter? This second part is, are you benevolent enough where you're really paying attention to your dependents and looking out for their emotional needs? Are you foreseeing things in a way that, you know, obviously when a woman is in an emotional, or anyone is in an emotional state, it's harder to look into the future, especially when a woman is pregnant or nursing. She's in that high feeling feminine state. Are you making the decisions? Are you foreseeing things for everyone that's best for everyone? Which sometimes means even saying no or discounting what a person says for what's really good for him. And I know this can seem like maybe a controversial statement, but I do think when done correctly, when the man is competent, when he's benevolent, when he's not hung up by his own traumas or wounds, and he can really be a secure individual that serves his dependents, that is what incentivizes a woman or children or followers or, you know, tribe members to be like, on a primal level, not even on an intellectual, but on a primal emotional level, yes, we trust that person. And when you accomplish that, you have emotional harmony, just like the couple that I mentioned, where they're not even on the same page politically, but they're so on the same page when it comes to the things that count. And I will say, in most relationships where there's an ideological divide in the beginning, when the relationship is really in harmony, when the man is doing his part of really taking care of her, and she's, you know, responding and kind of trusting him to take care of her, and, you know, there's that willing, conscious choice of handing over some level of external autonomy, the woman more often than not will kind of just trust him on political things, right? Like I've seen women who are like hardcore, maybe angry and perhaps wounded feminists from whatever, you know, reason. You know, maybe she enters into a relationship with a masculine man. They maybe have a little bit of ideological conflict at first, but, and this is maybe the most important thing to remember from this section, when her emotional needs are truly met, when she's truly taken care of, when she truly feels secure materially, spiritually, emotionally, most women, and I would even say most people on different layers, stop caring about the outside world so much. I know this maybe sounds like, I'm not talking about making women into kept women or anything, but like they stop caring so much about, and they just trust the man to deal with the outside world. And they maybe even drop, like I can think of a few couples where the woman kind of dropped her feminist ideals. Maybe she still, you know, has like certain things that she believes in, but like she's just like, oh yeah, you know, yeah, my husband's a little bit more conservative than I would like, but like I just trust him. And like she stops caring about this stuff. And over time, their reality merges, or she stops caring about the political stuff anyway, because politics is kind of by its nature a focus on the external. It's kind of a more, you know, I'll just say like a more masculine thing to care about, right? Like when a woman is really feeling her needs are met, her focus is more on the interior and on feelings and less on what's happening globally, let's say. And then finally, when that phase is taken care of, where the emotional incentives are set, where she truly trusts the man, and there's this kind of natural deference of external things where she, because she feels so loved and cared for and secure with this competent and benevolent perimeter setter that she's with, then and only then can you go into phase 3, where you're now explicitly talking about vision and maybe how you want to raise the kids, or certain choices, or how you want your relationship to be. Do you have like a weekly check-in about your relationship? You know, which I know some great relationships do. Those things only, though, this is kind of like your more typical mainstream relationship advice, planning for team goals or how you want to envision your future together. All of that is great, but that only really works when the previous layers are taken care of. Actually, there's a hierarchy to these. There's an order to these stages, right? Speaking explicitly about your relationship, even if you're like great communicators and you're having the perfect like NVC style communication that, the mainstream relationship experts say, all of that's great, but it only works if the previous thing is handled. Because if the woman doesn't, I'm speaking to men right now in hetero relationships. Like if your partner, if your wife, if your girlfriend doesn't really trust you, if she doesn't really trust you on that primal emotional level where she really surrenders to you, she trusts you to handle her emotions, she trusts you to help ground her when she's, going off or she's feeling overwhelmed, and she trusts you to handle the perimeter. If that's not there, all the talk about how should our relationship be, it doesn't matter. Right? The primal side is always going to override the superficial. And, just like, politics is downstream from culture, culture is downstream from nature. All of the explicit beliefs about your about your relationship is downstream from the feeling. And then further than that, the feeling of the dynamic between you, the emotional exchange, I would say, in many ways is downstream, or the prerequisite to that is the man as an individual having his shit handled. So I kind of assume anyone who's listening to this episode is in a committed relationship because it's most relevant to you. But I would say for any younger or like just single men who happen to listen to this, who plan on being in a relationship in the future, now is the perfect time to work on yourself, to basically morph yourself into the ideal puzzle piece that would fit that feminine, surrendered behavior in a woman that I would assume, if you're a neurotypical guy, would want in the future. So as a backwards recap, the exact framework that I am using in this group coaching program I'm making for men in committed relationships is starting with yourself, making sure that you're really living by the archetypal values that have you respect yourself. The second piece is, are you taking on the behaviors? Are you making decisions as the perimeter setter, whether that role is given to you explicitly or not? Are you making the decisions that incentivize your partner and your dependence to entrust that into you, allowing her to be in her feminine is another way to put it. And then finally go into the team goals, where you essentially have all of the relationship communication, the explicit stuff that everyone else recommends, but the previous things have to be to fit. And going backwards, there is an evolutionary reason why men might take on a certain morality or worldview that we now associate with political conservatism, the political right. There are incentives for why, or biological reasons, evolutionary reasons for why a woman would take on a more liberal or feeling-based or inclusion-focused egalitarian view that we now associate with the political left or liberalism. And those goes back even further into there are deep things that are specifically, that are even neurologically observable per that amygdala study that I referenced, that are reasons for why, evolutionary reasons why a certain kind of person might have a more conservative outlook or a liberal outlook. And I will finally end this episode now with a, which I guess with my kumbaya, or like my meta thesis, my thing that I really want to convey is that just like men and women need each other, or masculine and feminine people need each other, liberals and conservatives need each other, right? If you are a very political person who wants to point their finger at the other side of the aisle of like, oh, these bleeding hearts, they're such idiots, or these conservative people, all they care about is power. They are different evolutionary strategies. There are different evolutionary strategies that might be in many ways fueled by socioeconomic situations or cultural situations or whatever the initial conditions are. But you need both. You need both, right? If you're very liberal, you need conservatives, because liberals aren't serving the military, right? Like you need someone who's a little bit harder, who wants to interface with the harshness of reality, maybe has more aggressive tendencies. But you need that, right? Like I say this all, I had a lot, when I was going into the Marines, I had a lot of arguments with my New York liberal friends of like, man, the fact that we can have this debate right now in like a posh apartment in New York City is because there are other people who are choosing to defend the borders. I'm not for, I've been against pretty much every war the United States has been in during my lifetime. But there's still a reason why that has to exist for us to enjoy a liberal quality of life. And on the flip side, it's all my conservative friends who are now like pointing at the Marxist left. It's like, yeah, okay, there are many things that, just like I'm against, and I've been against all the American wars pretty much during my lifetime. I'm pretty hard against like a lot of what's happened on the left, the Marxist takeover, if you will, or wokeism. There's a lot to be upset about, a lot that can be easily criticized. But you need liberals in your society. You need liberals to balance things out, to care about the internal issues that conservatives don't prioritize. Like if you don't have that balance, that yin yang balance between the interior and the exterior, between the masculine and the feminine, between the conservative and the liberal, you don't have a healthy functioning society. So at the very least, you have to appreciate what the other side brings to the table, because when you can do that, when we both can do that, we have a harmonious society that is in balance. Anyways, that's that. If you are a man in a committed relationship who feels that the dynamic isn't the way you want to be, and you want to be a part of an intensive with other men in a similar situation. I mean, I'm specifically only allowing in men who are in committed relationships where you either have young children, I don't know exactly the age cutoff, but you're raising young children and you're in a committed relationship with a woman. If you want to be a part of that, you can apply in the application form that'll be included in this episode. You can also email me if you have questions, or DM me on Instagram. We're going to start that fairly soon. I'm going to keep it very small, and I want to make sure all the guys in the program are basically in the same life situation, committed relationship, young children, or planning on having children, because that's where the principles and the three-part system that I shared really makes sense. And I'm very excited to be in part of this group. I didn't really go into this in this episode, and maybe I'll go in another episode, but I had a lot of challenges transitioning into this type of relationship, right? I've had many fulfilling relationships that were based a little bit more on liberal freedom values, but things are different when you have dependents or planning on having dependents. Like you kind of have to take I won't even politicize it, but you have to take a more low volatility stance. And I do think, whereas in a more casual relationship setting, dating around, the ideas of masculine and feminine are a lot more abstract, and they're a lot more by choice. When you are creating life together, when a man and a woman are creating life together, there are certain things determined by nature that are not open to interpretation. And I did have a challenging transition into that, where it's like, okay, volatility is gone. There's certain freedoms are gone, but there's also an extremely beautiful, and I would say archetypal evolution for a man to become a father and have dependents. Again, whether you choose to take on traditional gender roles or not, there's something really amazing about that, but it's a challenging transition. So anyways, if you're interested in that, if you're a man with young children or planning on having children with your partner, hit me up or apply below. Thanks for listening to guys. I know I tried to make this episode shorter. It's a little bit shorter than 2 hours this time. I didn't go on a historical rant this time, but hope this was a useful episode. I hope it was interesting. I had a good time. Hopefully I didn't speak too fast. If you listen on any of the podcasting apps, I'd really appreciate it if you drop a rating. Probably should have been asking this for listeners from years ago, but yeah. Anyway, that would mean a lot if you drop a rating if you enjoyed this episode. See you in the next one. Thank you. Goodbye.